It's the Wonkhe Show. We discuss international strategy, chat about cheating, we speak about skills, and we have a very different type of recruitment crisis. It's all coming up.
And all of a sudden then you kind of get a bit of a sort of balloon effect, don't you? So I don't know if there's a sense of actually it will feel far more strenuous on the system than it might do otherwise because of, you know, kind of where we might be up to with numbers currently going through the system. I don't know.
Welcome to The Wonkhe Show, your direct way into higher education, policy, people and politics. I'm Rachel Firth and here to walk at pace through the busy streets of higher education policy. As usual, we have three great guests. In London, we have Kate Wicklow, Policy Manager at Guild HE. Kate, your highlight of the week, please.
So yesterday we hosted a practice-informed teaching conference with Advanced HE and we brought together staff from in the sector to discuss the positive ways in which technical skills can be an asset to the learning environment. And that's really important for us at Guild HE because many of our members, their staff currently work in the industries that they also teach in, and it's something that we need to highlight more widely to the sector.
And in Sheffield, we have Robin Webber-Jones, who's Vice Principal at the Sheffield College. Robin, give us your highlight of the week, please.
Hello there. So yesterday I went to the Office for Students launch of the kind of revised access and participation plan guidance, but the absolute highlight was after lunch. There were a group of students did a performance on their experiences as black and minority ethnic students entering into HE within the UK and what that meant and what it felt like. And it was a really, really poignant performance, actually, that kind of spoke volumes, I think, to everybody in the room.
And live from Wonkhe HQ, we have Wonkhe's Associate Editor, Minto Felix. Minto, if you would, your highlight of the week, please.
Thanks, Rachel. It's a very close two-way split between hearing from Alison Wolfe earlier in the week about the history of higher education policy, which is the second part of her three-part lecture series at King's College London, and doing a very, very vibrant spin class with yourself, with your good self, which you know is something that we enjoy doing together. Yeah,
that was my highlight, and I feel slightly less worthy than everyone else's highlight. That you know, it's just as flippant as a spin class. That's as good as the week gets. Right. Let's crack on. This week, we kick off with the government's announcement of their international education strategy, global growth and prosperity. The policy paper sets out how government and the education sector will build on UK strengths to take advantage of global opportunities. So, Minto, what's caught your eye in this international education strategy document?
So, Rachel, I think in being able to understand this document, we have to see it in the context of the conversation that the country's been having more broadly about immigration over the last few years. And, you know, the important thing about this document is that it strikes a refreshing different tone from, for example, the 2010 net migration target that was set, which we know had an impact for international students because it sent a message to them that perhaps they weren't welcome here. I think it's really interesting that the report also references an ambition of increasing to 600,000 international students from the current 430,000 students rather than a target. And I'll come back to why that's, curious that it's an ambition, not a target. But despite the refreshing tone, I think if we were to be a lot more serious, if the government was to be a lot more serious about its commitment to international students, then they would have gone further. I mean, at the heart of this strategy, it's about mobility. And frankly, the report does not say enough, or it does not go far enough about what we're doing to improve the immigration and visa conditions that will see more international students want to come to study in the UK, but also we know that international students want to work here beyond their study. So the strategy does set out some previously announced changes to immigration that will see masters taught students and undergraduate students be able to work 6 months beyond completion of their study. But really, this needs to be a lot longer so that students actually have an incentive to stay and contribute to the UK. There are about 20 other actions in the report. Some of them are quite minor, some more major. But really, at the heart of it, I think it should have gone a lot further.
I thought it was really interesting, actually, reading the report, because one of the things that we struggle with as a kind of part of the skills education ecosystem is recruiting teachers in STEM and things. So, we know that we've got a kind of shortage of individuals entering STEM subjects in order to be able to do the infrastructure projects, etc., that are currently on running and in the pipeline and things. And actually, one of the things we really struggle with is recruiting teachers to teach people to get better at STEM and to inspire them to progress to degrees and postgraduate study and things. And one of the techniques really that the FE and skills sector has used before is to go to international students that have taught here and said, well, let's take your skills and see if we can turn you into teachers. But actually, if the kind of visa conditions don't get better for those individuals, then it becomes really problematic and not a very cost-effective way of doing things. And I think there's a real opportunity there as part of a kind of just internationalising the curriculum type agenda, where actually some really interesting work could happen. And because of various visa issues and things, it strikes me as a bit of a kind of missed opportunity, really.
Kate, your members are small and specialist institutions. Do you have a take on their behalf, as it were, on this new education strategy?
Yes, we welcome the sentiment of it, but I think the problem is that there aren't any kind of tangible things that can be done right now without the Home Office kind of supporting the project, actually. We have issues around visas. We already know that this report says that we can kind of extend the post-study work visa system. Well, that's great, but it's actually not for a very long time. And also, I think without removing student numbers out of net migration, there's no way that we're going to be able to recruit this many students without the wider political issue around immigration to come up. And the only way that is possible is through extending our TNE provision, which, many of our members don't have because they're small providers. But also it's really costly and also very high risk to providers to do that. And I don't think it's something that people should be getting into lightly just because we're being encouraged to export more HE.
My kind of observations on these kind of reports is always that they do focus on economic impact, and it kind of misses a piece of social impact, really. And I think that kind of thing about net migration and migration numbers, it becomes kind of quite a binary debate. And I think in educational institutions, having more international students and having more international staff actually adds an element of social mobility that perhaps you can't define, but I think it's there, and it's kind of, you can touch it, and it's there in atmosphere. And I do feel sometimes with these kind of reports that sometimes we miss that bit of impact, actually.
And I think related to that too, Robin, is, you have the social mobility piece, the economic piece, but also this is about lives. It's about human capital. And I think one of the gaps in the strategy, though that it may be an export strategy, is that we haven't spoken about the supports that international students require to be able to thrive. There is a reference to English language support and strengthening that aspect of their experience. But we know that a big concern for international students when they're moving to another country to study is around safety, is around feeling welcomed. It's around their mental health. And, other countries, competitors in this space in places like Australia and the US have been really successful, I think, at capturing the hearts and minds of international students with that kind of language that I think could have really been encouraged and reinforced through this strategy.
I agree. And I think it's quite telling, actually, that some of the key issues going on at the moment in kind of the student experience world is around mental health support, well-being, student support for kind of the life provision that isn't just the academic stuff. And I think if international students are reading UK newspapers, they're not going to see a very welcoming environment for them to come into.
Okie dokie, let's see who's been blogging for us this week.
My name is Professor Nora Colton, and I'm the Joint Director of Education at UCL's Institute of Ophthalmology and Moorfields Eye Hospital. My piece is about what Brexit means to higher education's widening participation agenda. As we continue to see the possibility of leaving the EU debated in Parliament, it's essential for us to understand what this could mean for higher education. Brexit needs contextualized, not just in terms of the relationship with the EU as a funder for research and also a location for recruiting students and staff, but also in terms of our widening participation agenda and the outcomes of our disadvantaged students who come from various backgrounds within society. Since 2000 financial crisis, which was really devastating, particularly in terms of youth and youth unemployment, we've seen the economy recover and youth unemployment go down significantly in the UK. And as we've witnessed this, we've also seen an increase in university joiners from state-funded schools and colleges, and at a higher rate than even private-funded schools. We've also seen a rise in Black and Asian and other ethnic groups coming to university. So all this is really good and really good for the widening participation agenda that higher education is so committed to. However, lessons from the past teach us that economic uncertainty bears down on most all of those who are vulnerable in society. Although the situation for university participation and graduate outcomes looks promising currently, we also know that those from lower income backgrounds are often receiving the spillover effect of improvements that help those more fortunate first. So as we enter that final stretch towards a solution on what the Brexit deal might actually look like, UKHE must not only concern itself with how it was going to mitigate the impact on research and staff and students, but it's also got to look a lot closer to home.
Right, next up, the news that the UK government has launched a series of measures which it says will help beat the cheats at university. The launch is the first in a series of interventions on higher education being fronted out by Education Secretary Damian Hinds. Kate, can you tell us more on this one, please?
Yeah, so this is an issue that's been bubbling away for a while, and actually was the last part of the podcast last week. So some of you may be up to date with what's going on. But basically, in 2016, QAA wrote a report to the sector kind of detailing the rise in these custom essay services being advertised in the UK and highlighted some of the key considerations for us and government to think about to crack down on some of those. And then that kind of led to a report that government asked QAA together with us at Guild HE, UK and NUS to develop some kind of further guidance for institutions to help identify where contract cheating had been used by students and also to work with students to develop a better sense of academic integrity to kind of discourage them from cheating. And that was published in August 17. So again, this is, quite a while ago now. That led to the BBC running a big expose on the widespread advertising of these services. And we then wrote to Damian Hinds in September last year asking for action, especially in relation to setting legislation and working with the international community to tackle cheating. And 45 vice-chancellors signed that letter, and we've been waiting kind of since for a government response formally. So this I think is coming from that letter. So we obviously welcome the interjection, and he's called out big online players such as PayPal to stop processing payments for these services, which I think is going to be of great benefit. And also Google and YouTube have committed to removing hundreds of the advertisements for essay writing services on their sites. But other social media platforms like Facebook and Instagram haven't acknowledged the issue yet. And I, for one, have certainly seen adverts from these types of services on my Facebook feed in the last 6 months. So it's definitely something that's not going away.
So, yeah, it's super interesting. Our colleague Jim Dickinson has, he would post things on Twitter about needing help with an essay. And it was incredible how quickly the bots got back to him offering the services. Robin, I'd be interested to hear your take on this as a principal of a college. What is your view on the beating the cheats?
I mean, I think it's quite interesting. There's some elements in the report there, aren't there, where kind of Damian Hinds he's almost kind of suggested a sort of US type system where people kind of swear allegiance to kind of good behaviour and not doing this kind of thing, and et cetera, which I thought was interesting, because then you kind of start comparing what induction and things like that begins to look like for students and how they find kind of belonging to their own institution. One of the interesting things, I mean, college HE generally has much smaller class sizes than you would find in a higher education institution, and it's a kind of very different type of student body generally. And one of the things that we've done is a kind of an identity survey, if you like, with our college HE population, just to, I suppose, get a sense of what their experience is like and how they react to some of these things. And it's quite interesting that they basically kind of come back and say, well, we're in small groups, we like being taught in small groups, that's what we need, and we feel as if we've kind of got a great bond with each other. So it's almost like this kind of notion of cheating would be frowned on within, do you know what I mean, within a group, because there's kind of less space to hide, I guess.
But interestingly, that's not dissimilar to the honour code, bizarrely. Is it? They all sign up to this pact of like, I'm allegiance with my institution, my colleagues and such.
Yeah, well, exactly, and it's so it's kind of interesting that it does sort of sit down. I mean, I don't know how comfortable this honour code sits with me personally, actually, but
it's an odd one, isn't it? Because we do talk about academic integrity from the beginning. We've constantly had kind of sessions at induction around what plagiarism is and kind of forms of teaching and collusion, and we provide students with the academic regulations. So I think, on one hand, we're doing this a little bit already. But on the other hand, I think Robin's right. In a very large institution, it's much easier to get lost in all the other students. So actually this becomes quite an easy win for some students who are, under considerable amounts of pressure, often both financially and academically, and they can kind of get away with it because their tutor doesn't know their voice.
I think the other aspect is, whether it be honour codes or inductions, what we're fundamentally trying to do here is how do we stop students from cheating? And that's the problem. And I think all of these ideas are interventions. But, the other things that we have to think about, if the problem is about how do we stop students from cheating, is asking the questions of, do we have the right assessments in place? Essays are about one method of assessment. There's so much in the way of classroom-based assessment, group projects, presentations, and so many other techniques that, we could be putting in place to prevent students from cheating, or indeed considering what are the implications of an increasing workload. So I think there are other levers that we can pull on to have effect on that culture of students from cheating.
Well, I was going to say, I'd kind of fully agree with that. And also, I think there were some students that I was kind of working with previously, and we did all that stuff in induction about plagiarism and assessment regulations and all the rest of it, through induction. But of course, their first sort of summative assignment didn't come 6 to 8 weeks later. And actually lots of the feedback we were then getting was actually all of that stuff that you did at the start kind of needs to be repeated. We need to go through again. We need to know where we need to go to get help as people kind of transition through levels of learning. And that kind of made me think about whole sort of infrastructure that you can put in to kind of guide students through good academic practice. And I don't know if, as well as looking at assessment instruments, actually looking at that whole bit of the student journey transitioning from level 3 and, either an A-level or a B-Tech type of study generally, which is both of them have very particular ways of working, into a kind of framework for higher education qualification type landscape, which has, kind of a very different philosophy around assessment practice, I think.
But there is a kind of wider issue in there. I agree there's more that universities can do and also students can do to kind of take ownership of this. But there are some legislative changes that can be made. Other countries have banned this within their country. So it means that these companies can't advertise anymore. And because it's such a global issue, actually, we need that kind of legislation to underpin all of the practice that we're doing, because it's all well and good us saying don't cheat, but if there's still wide access to these platforms, people are still going to be able to.
And the real tricky thing is when these companies, of course, infiltrate campuses physically, whether it be leaflet-based advertising or through word of mouth. That's how they've become what they have been. So, how do we really get into the culture where these essay mills are really pervasive in the student body?
Interestingly, as Kate said, we talked about this last week. It was the last segment, and Chris Shelley from the University of Greenwich spoke of people being stood outside the libraries, just like listening into people's conversations. If they were struggling with certain things, they would be, they would be physically on campus asking people if they needed help with these essays. Minto, if I may, you are of course a colleague from Australia, and you've worked in the Australian sector. Are essay mills prevalent in the Australian sector? Is there a culture of paying people or companies rather, trying to charge people for their services?
I think, Rachel, it probably is, but we don't have the level of, I think, public awareness about it as perhaps is the case in the UK and the US. As you know, we have a large proportion of international students. We have a very large institutions where, to Kate's point about students feeling lost, that can at times be the case. And so I think it would be easy for students to access these services that are largely online. But I certainly haven't come across the public awareness or the public outcry in the way that we perhaps see in the States and the United Kingdom.
Now, every week this season on the podcast, we are delving deep into the sector's past to uncover stories of how things were and how things came to be. With Nottingham Trent's academic registrar Mike Radcliffe, here is part 11 of the hidden history of HE.
So, one of the questions that arises from educating women is, should they have a special curriculum for women? Should they be doing the same as men? What's going to be happening? Though you have to put this in context. It's very important not to take historical things out of context and laugh at people in the past. Never want to do that. But if in the context of what women's careers were like, well, what would a useful degree for women look like? So the King's College Department of Women has decided that it's going to explore what that might look like, and it gets some benefactions from outside to set up a course to think about a useful course for women to do. And they settled on household and social science as the model that they should take forward. So they start to develop a course in this. Now this quite quickly becomes quite an important part of the college, and they transfer back to King's the English and history and other kinds of subjects, and leaving the college to really concentrate on household and social science. Now, in its heyday, you can get a proper BSc degree from the University of London in household and social science, in which you learn organic and physical chemistry, general biology, applied chemistry, bacteriology, household work, special household work, institutional management, and the tests that come with this are just wonderful. So what you get is you get this lovely publication of exam papers. So you get a sense of what people should be doing. So the exam paper from 1921 talks about what should you do for economic biology. And the question is, give an account of the habits and life history of the itch mite. Write an essay on insects and disease. So you get this kind of breadth of thing. But what makes it clear what's going on here is the practical exam that you get to sit. So one of the things you get to do is you have a day exam. You get to take the exam from in the morning. You get 10 to 1 for part 1. Plan meals for a day in a middle-class family for each of the seasons. Give the quantities required and compare the energy values. What principles would guide you in the choice of food? And there's a practical exam, so that's just theoretical still, so the practical exam, 10 till 4. Prepare a day's meal for a family consisting of father, mother and 2 children, using as little fuel as possible. Hand in a list of fresh ingredients required by 11 a.m. and calculate the price of each meal. Second part, all utensils used are to be cleaned and left for inspection. It includes the washing up. It's a wonderful idea. Now, obviously, as this is, this is not without opposition. Some years before, there's this wonderful suffragette publication called The Free Woman, run by a woman called Dora Marsden, and she's got a friend who's at this college teaching on this thing, and she's quite forthright about this course. As you might imagine, she says, the aims of those who frame such a retrograde scheme are in radical opposition to those of women who are deserving the freedom and development of women. They aim at perpetuating women's inferiority by perfecting her in the role which puts her in the greatest difficulties of her development. I protest that a more impudent piece of charlatanry has never been perpetuated before in the history of education. Dora Marsden goes at her. Now, eventually, obviously, it wanes and it moves off, and what comes Queen Elizabeth College goes into more normal branches of science. But for a moment, there is this wonderful BSc degree in household and social science.
Now, this week, the Resolution Foundation has published a report titled Pick Up the Pace, the Slowdown in Education Attainment Growth and Its Widespread Effects. It's a really fascinating report. If you haven't read it, it will be linked in the show notes. And this report highlights changes in educational attainment. So, Robin, what did you make of this report?
I thought it was a really interesting report because it really begins by kind of almost comparing level 2, so GCSE equivalent provision and attainment rates and changes there kind of right the way through to postgraduate study. And essentially what it says is between 1997 and 2003, the kind of average increase in the share of 25 to 28-year-olds with a bachelor's degree or higher grew by 1.8 percentage points, and that's kind of slowed between 2004 and 2010 to 0.7 percentage points, although with a maybe a little bit more growth in recent times. But it also highlights that the number of students kind of leaving education with higher than a level 2 qualification has increased. So there's it's fallen by a third, effectively, those leaving with level 2. And also that the kind of the number of people with GCSE kind of A stars to C continues to drop even in recent times by sort of 0.3%. So essentially what it's saying is the kind of more people are gaining high level skills, so level 3 and above, over the past few years. And I think what's interesting is there's all sorts of kind of levers that have happened within the Department for Education that might be the result of this. So we've had the raising of the participation age, which has essentially meant that people have to stay in full-time education or on an apprenticeship or in employment until the age of 18. We've also had, and it's certainly kind of hit the sixth form and college sector and independent training provider sector harder, kind of funding rule, which is known as conditions of funding. So if people don't have their GCSE English Maths 9 to 4 or A star to C or equivalent, they have to keep going and taking them, which essentially raises the sort of full level 2 GCSE quota that people have. And there's also been kind of those initiatives around Aim Higher and then, NCOP and everything else that have basically encouraged people to undertake a degree study. And what's quite interesting in the report, it says that some of these kind of increases in participation aren't there at master's level. So, it's kind of getting a degree therefore becomes the new norm. And there's almost a widening participation front that sort of opens up at level 7 and beyond. And then the report kind of puts this in the guise of Brexit, really, and says, well, if we've got, a significant chunk of the population, I think it mentions about kind of 26%, who are working in jobs where higher level skills, higher level qualifications are needed, and we haven't kind of got access to that labour market in the future, what does that mean for the country? What does that mean for kind of how we might develop skills? Interestingly, the report doesn't come up necessarily with any solutions to that, but I've got one or two ideas of my own which I'm sure we can share shortly.
Yeah, so I think first of all, I think we should be really proud of the fact that there are far less people coming out of the school system with no qualifications, because the way in which the UK economy has changed is more towards kind of knowledge based and technical skills rather than kind of lower level non-skilled work. So this report is really helpful actually in our kind of articulating the need for higher level skills within our workforce. But you're right, it's awkward that when you then break it down by social mobility, it doesn't seem to have made a huge impact at the higher end. And so, we do have a problem with the level of education of some students up to masters, because they're not getting the additional opportunities to do that either through the funding process or through other mechanisms. And, it's time to think about how NCOP could maybe kind of push it further than just getting into university, but also what you do afterwards. But I think the other interesting thing for me in this report was talking about how the level of education relates to the skills needs. And I don't think we've really worked out yet how employers and how wider industries can actively get involved in developing curriculums or developing content that's practically useful for them. And, there are so many conversations we're having at the moment around kind of technical education more generally that could really help support employers to get a better sense of the education provision available. Well,
I fully agree with you, and I think kind of running alongside, we're in an interesting landscape at the minute actually, because we've got kind of Augur running, and it was interesting that the kind of Augur review was launched in an FE college, because take the words out of the speech and things. I think symbolically that was the kind of big thing about Augur, and almost a sense of kind of redressing where and how a skill system might work. And alongside all of this, of course, we've had the DFE running the review of level 4-5, now technical education. It was just level 4-5 education. I think as part of a response to kind of people knowing that productivity post-crash really has dropped and hasn't really picked back up. And, rather than kind of accepting that maybe as a new norm, I think people are going, well, actually we need to do something about that, because that supports social mobility and that remain, and the report has it in there, actually great regional variations. But until we start to get kind of parity of esteem across level 4, 5, 6, 7 and a parity of funding, then actually it's, all of that's quite challenging. And I think it's difficult really, because we've got a HE system at the minute, which is essentially open market, kind of lots of players coming in. It's kind of neoliberal, I guess, in that sense. And yet almost, a sense that actually if things were planned a bit differently and the system was set up a bit differently, actually people being able to access level 4, 5 and beyond in different ways, might work a bit better.
It's another example of where the education sector more broadly is being blamed for some of the skill shortages in the industry. And I think one of the other telling graphs in this report is that it says that those that have lower level qualifications are far less likely to then receive further training when they're in work. And that, and that's something that, we can do as education providers to provide the education need, but also employers need to pay for that as well. It can't all just be centrally funded through government pots. And I think the main issue with the apprentice levy at the moment is that most employers either don't understand how to use their levy effectively, or there aren't enough standards available for them to spend their money. So they're kind of caught in this trap where they can't spend what they've got. So we really do need to sort that out. And also, I mean, we've called in the past for that to be extended outside of apprenticeships into other kind of frameworked qualifications where that's relevant, to kind of ease some of that push at the moment.
I think, look, we really do have to think about the role of the employer in this. The report said, sorry, not this report, but we know that in the past, the Employee Skills Survey has said that 22% of vacancies have gone unfulfilled for skill-related reasons. So there is something clearly that is happening where employers are not getting what they want. But my question is, are they signalling what it is they want, and do they demonstrate a stake in curating what it is they want? But also, I think it's not about blaming employers in the same way that we don't want the education sector to be blamed, but about really encouraging the types of experiments that do yield outcomes. I'm thinking of a case study, for example, at the University of Birmingham, who partnered with PwC to develop a Bachelor of Science program, but it really focused on entrepreneurship and digital literacy and sort of that whole field. And that's a really key skills need. We know that. It's a great example of two big institutions working together. And it, adds, I think, real economic, but more so social mobility value in our Midland region. So how do we support and create space for more experiments like that?
Now it's time for Yes, but does it correlate? Here to set this week's correlation question is Wonkhe's Associate Editor, David Kernahan.
Welcome to Wonkhe's wonkiest and funkiest podcast segment. This week I've set a deceptively simple question: the number of male first degree students against the number of female first degree students for 2017-18. For a number of years there has been substantially more female than male students in UKHE, but how evenly are they distributed between providers? How does subject mix affect proportions? Yes, but does it correlate?
So I think that the kind of first part of that is there's no correlation between providers, but I think there probably might be a correlation between the subject mix.
I think there should be a correlation between the subject mix, and therefore there will be a slight difference by providers, because not all providers deliver everything and there are some specialists in the sector.
It does correlate, but maybe not as well as you might expect. R-squared is 0.85, and a look at the graph suggests some significant outliers. Notably, the University of the Arts first degree population is 75% female, but Imperial College is 64% male. If you're wondering about non-binary first degree students, the largest percentage, 2.44%, is at Coulthard Institute, whereas the largest number, 55, can be found at King's College London. I've excluded the Open University from the main plot due to its sheer size, and please note that HESA student data is rounded to the nearest 5 for data protection reasons. And, as always, where the data doesn't exist, I've not plotted it. See you next time.
And finally, this week we have some fascinating data and projections on Wonkhe.com about the future demand for higher education. Our friends at Data HE have put together a fascinating blog piece about rapid student number growth over the next coming years and decades. So Minto, what does the future hold for us?
Rachel, so this graph shows that there is indeed a demographic dip that occurs pretty imminently. But what is very interesting is that immediately following this dip is that there is a unprecedented level of growth in the number of 18-year-olds that we have in the UK. And so what that really highlights as a question, as a challenge for the higher education sector, is how do we cope with this growth? So to be specific, the five-year rate of population growth reaches 17% in the mid-2020s, which and between 2020 and 2030, the population increases by 27%, which equates to almost an extra million 18-year-olds over this decade. So the real question for us to grapple with is, are our institutions prepared and poised to actually accommodate this growth?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting report, and it's something that we've known for a little while, actually. We've been talking a lot in the admissions portion of the HE sector about how at the moment recruitment is challenging because there are less 18-year-olds, but they will be coming back soon. But I don't think people necessarily recognise that the level of 18-year-olds that there are going to be in 10 years' time. And my worry is that whilst, yes, some universities can expand, yes, FE colleges can also expand, and yes, we can create some new providers, actually all we're doing is saying, well, all of these people have to go into higher education. And there are definitely some other routes for these people to take that, as we were talking about earlier in the kind of review of level 4 and 5, whether there are other ways to skill these people going forward. But I just don't think that all universities are going to be able to expand to this level. And also, I mean, from the perspective of Guild HE, a lot of our members don't want to expand.
But isn't the real challenge that, because these numbers track the kind of appetite for going to university as well. So the demand, the people who want to go on to study at university, and it's tracked against the amount of places that there will be, and there just won't be enough for the people that want to go. So do we not end up in a situation where, you know, people whose parents may have, you know, gone through universities, their children then do not have the same opportunities they have, and that's going to be, you know, a tough pill for a lot of people to swallow, right? Sure.
I think we're back to kind of that sort of sense of kind of what joined up policy, you know, actually looks like, and you know, you almost delve into kind of what's the purpose of education, because, you know, surely some of it is back to that gaining the skills and things that people need to flourish in their careers. But there's also an element of it which is about kind of, you know, supporting people to develop social skills and kind of have broader cultural experiences and everything else. So, you know, there is a real dilemma there, isn't there, in denying things to people. I mean, I think the other thing is that's kind of interesting about it, and to an extent, you know, schools have been through this, and kind of FE is going through this, and universities will go through this, and probably just beginning this. There was kind of contraction of young people working their way through the system. And all of a sudden, then you kind of get a bit of a sort of balloon effect, don't you? So I don't know if there's a sense of actually it will feel far more strenuous on the system than it might do otherwise, because of, you know, kind of where we might be up to with numbers currently going through the system. I don't know.
And also, I think there's an issue at the moment around kind of the funding of education more broadly. And so at the moment, lots of providers are contracting their provision because of the affordability of it. But with this rapid expansion, I think they're not going to be able to cope with those numbers so quickly. I
was just going to say, I think this piece of insight comes at a very politically opportune time, with the Augur Review almost imminent, because no doubt if the panel were looking at a graph like this, they'd be asking themselves, well, how do we sustainably finance the system overall? And so these are important questions to think about, not in the context of the short term, where providers might be doing, you know, this way or that way, but actually in the context of long term, where if students are expressing that they would like the choice to access higher education, then for their own individual growth, but also knowing what the values that higher education presents to society, we have an obligation to provide that, don't we? And so I think, you know, it probably is perhaps a little narrow to suggest that, you know, institutions might not scale up because they don't want to. We've got to think about what the real needs of our society are over that longer period of time, and be imaginative in how we respond.
And I think you're right, the imagination needs to come not just from 3-year full-time undergraduate programmes. We need to see much more flexibility in the delivery of education.
So that is about it for this week. Remember to delve deeper into anything we've discussed today. You'll find the links in the show notes. And don't forget, you can subscribe to the podcast automatically. Just search for The Wonkhe Show via iTunes or your favourite Android podcast directory. Or you can find the feed that you need on wonkhe.com/podcast. And if you fancy appearing as a guest on The Wonkhe Show, do drop us an email on team@wonkhe.com and we will be in touch. So thanks to Kay and to Robin and to Minto and everyone at Team Wonkhe for making this happen. And until next week, stay meaningful.